Yeah. We would act it out. Yeah.
Feel free. Here. Yes.
No?
This is jointly sponsored.
Oh, wow. And it's like a master's program? Okay. When is that cycle?
It's very similar, but I mean,
Yeah.
You waited 33 years to come back. What's another 3 minutes?
Yeah.
and everyone else.
Yes. Yeah, me too. Yeah. Be happy. Look around, little cliffs, rocks.
Well, the AMA has been like.
Oh, really? Okay, good, good. What? Yes, yeah. Oh, yeah, you're right. Yes. It's a good program. Very good.
We get to standing room only.
Awesome. Yes, that would be very nice. Well, when you decide,
Tried that.
Let me see your yeah. 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 Okay.
I was like as shocked as anyone, but like.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I'm consoling myself. Something Freudian.
Hey everybody, welcome. Welcome to this jointly sponsored event from the Center for Bioethics and the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine. My name is Wes Boyd. I'm Director of Education in the Center. I'm really delighted to have Larry Churchill here today, who is one of my teachers in graduate school and mentors. Larry is the Stallman Professor of Medical Ethics Emeritus at Vanderbilt. He played a major role in developing 2 bioethics programs, Vanderbilt and the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, where he was chair of social medicine when I met Larry 37 years ago. Larry, I was 12 years old. I'm using that joke a lot these days. Larry won teaching awards at both Vanderbilt and UNC. He is a member of the National Academy of Medicine and a fellow at the Hastings Center. He is the author of 7 books, including most recently Bioethics Re-envisioned, A Path Toward Health Justice, the last chapter of which, as I recall, deals with climate change, and a forthcoming volume with Elizabeth Lanphier, Bioethical Responsibilities in 21st Century Crises. Larry's work has been featured in a lot of popular news outlets, including USA Today, the New York Times, Bill Moyer's Journal, and a documentary by Alex Gibney. Larry is one of the OGs in bioethics. He's literally been around since the inception of the field. He has so much knowledge about the entire history of what bioethics has looked like that it's pretty incredible. He also has been an inspiration for me. I spent many hours in his office at UNC and learned a lot, not only academically, but how to be as a person. When one looks at oneself in an honest and decent way, and what it looks like to comport oneself in a really professional manner, like 24/7. So I learned a ton, both academically and in that way. When I was in grad school, he was one of the very few faculty members I saw who was at the absolute top of his game academically, but also just a mensch of a person. When we were talking yesterday, Larry recalled giving the 1992 gay lecture here at Harvard and remembered the quote unquote very steep auditorium. Everyone's laughing because everyone knows it. So we had to go in and have a look, and it's still just as steep as it was. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome my mentor, friend, and colleague back to HMS to talk about bioethics and global warming. Larry, thank you.
Thank you, Wes. I just wish I deserved that, right? But it's a pleasure to be back at Harvard and to see old and dear friends, former colleagues, former students and colleagues. It's great to be here. And I should say, especially during this time, since I'm an admirer of the stance, if I may say so, that you are taking. Bravo. So. It was about 8 years ago that I became convinced that after studying all the typical issues in bioethics, that global warming was perhaps the most important issue that we face. And so I've spent a fair amount of time trying to educate myself, trying to get up to speed with the science, trying to follow the social changes, and trying to convince other people in bioethics that this is something that they should be concerned about. I should say this has been an uphill battle. Not because they aren't interested or curious, but because there are so many other things on their plates, and it also seems like just an impossible problem. So I'm talking about that today just because in some sense I can't stop talking about it. And I think we have to work together toward ameliorating some of the difficulties we will all soon be facing and hopefully reversing some of the potential damage. This is my most recent candidate for a bumper sticker. Save our home, sacrifice comfort, not children. Because it is in part our comfortable lives as high carbon users that is a big part of the problem. And also because the people who will pay for this will be our great grandchildren, who will have a much reduced quality of life because of what we are now doing worldwide. You're probably familiar with this graph. This was published in Science 2023. On the left is Exxon's predictions, and these are decades old. Begun even before the turn of the century, about what the use of gas and oil would do to the environment. And on the right is the scientific analysis. And you'll see how closely they follow each other. And Exxon Mobil was dead right about this, but they continued to deny that it was the case. Never misled the public, they said. despite of decades of misinformation and also promoting doubt about climate science. They were not alone in this, of course. This is a world map of the devastation from global warming. In the blue are the flooding zones. In the salmon are the heat zones. The yellow is the water stress. The red are the wildfires. And the turquoise are the hurricanes and typhoons. And you'll see there's no region in the world that is absent from this. I listened to a lecture by Cass Sunstein a couple of months ago about global warming and was very interested because he was debating about whether we should use the national burden or the world burden as a motivation for justice and what we ought to be trying to do. And he came down, I think appropriately, on the world burden, in part because we are, as probably you know, the second greatest polluter of the environment, followed only by China. And per capita, of course, we more than double the Chinese contribution. This is just another graph that shows you 1.5 degrees centigrade rise over the pre-industrial level was the measure for a long time after the Paris agreements. And just to note, we've exceeded that. And we're headed over 3 degrees centigrade probably by the turn of the century. Another graph, carbon emissions surpassing the safe level, 335 parts per million some time ago. And many of us thought, I think, that actually what the Biden administration was trying to do, subsidizing and promoting the efficiency of wind and solar was going to make a huge difference in terms of displacing gas and oil. It didn't. There's more gas and oil production than there ever has been. So we're doing both, actually, regrettably, instead of one replacing the other. These are cities that are most likely, not that they will be, most likely, most vulnerable to be underwater. By 2030, that's the world list: Amsterdam, Basra, New Orleans, and so on. There are some obvious emissions, and I've seen several lists of these. Jakarta should be on the list, Delhi, and US cities by 2050, Miami leading the list, but many of the places you might expect. Just a reminder of kind of where things are headed, although we never talked really about this. Health effects. This is hard to keep up with. Food and water shortages, flooding and the salinization of arable land, typhoons, more severe hurricanes, homelessness, migration, and its nutritional deficits, dirty air, drought and fires, heat deaths, mental illness resulting from social collapse. Actually, I wanted to stop here and ask those of you who are clinicians and who are public health officials and others of you in the know about this, what have you seen? Can you tell me a bit more about this to flesh this out? Because the deleterious health effects are one of the things I think that could help us move forward. What have you seen in your practices? What have you seen in your own studies? Yes.
One of our colleagues who's not here, Matt Bonds, has been doing studies of healthcare services in Madagascar over the past 15 years. And the average travel time between home and clinic has been increasing because roads are washing out more quickly than they can be repaired by extreme storms.
Thank you.
There have been multiple dengue outbreaks, the biggest ever in cities that have never, around the world, that have never had these outbreaks in the past, presumably because of change in vector distribution.
Right, right.
I spoke with someone in Indonesia who has a small NGO that works on these issues and who said that the amount of sheer heat-related mental distress in families is quite remarkable.
Yes. There are practices actually that have specialized almost completely in climate trauma and grief from climate changes. We'll see, I fear, a lot more of that. Anyone else? Yes.
Well, I think in the mental health sphere, we've seen both here and globally, the displacement of persons and due to natural disasters has risen rapidly and required a huge global response with inadequate resources to be able to respond.
Right, yes, thank you. Okay, there could be a whole talk on the injustices, but this is just my little abbreviated version. I like the Oxfam analysis because it shows that worldwide, it's the richest 10% of the population that have been the greatest polluters, accounting for over half of the pollutants in the atmosphere. And the irony, of course, the bitter irony is that the 20% of the lowest classes worldwide will suffer first and suffer the most for reasons in terms of their fragility, where they live, their ability to sustain themselves in hard times. So, I've already mentioned ExxonMobil. They are big targets, and it's easy just to be angry with them. You know, there's a lot of justification for that. But I've noticed recently something happening in terms of the way they talk about this. Initially, the big oil companies were saying, we can be part of the solution, and talk about things that they were going to do or would be doing or might now be doing that they thought would ameliorate the problem. So there was a lot of greenwashing. I think they weren't doing much of anything, actually. But now the attitude has shifted, and I'm calling this climate realism because that's the term the defenders use. The quote from the CEO of Saudi Aramco: "We should abandon the fantasy of phasing out oil and gas." And the CEO of Exxon: "The world needs to get real. The problem is not oil and gas, it's emissions." Now, if you understand this, I hope you can explain it to me after the session. And the American Petroleum Institute, as you might expect. But it's just a shift, I think, because it's now okay to say these kinds of things. But in another sense, we're all responsible. Why? Well, because we're living an amazing lifestyle. We're living like in past generations would have been kings and queens. We have conveniences. We use power for damn near everything in our lives every day. And so we're big carbon producers. And, you know, the traffic is one kind of thing. Think about this. Killing a cow, which has taken 5 times more energy to raise into a piece of beef, slaughtering it, sending it thousands of miles in a refrigerated truck to Boston, where it gets sold for an exorbitant price. And it's bad for your health. But so there's a sense in which the way we live is in fact a part of the issue. And I want to keep talking about this a little, because I'm not suggesting that we all become monks and return to caves, but a more self-conscious and moderate kind of living. This is another issue that really concerns me, and that is we don't know where we're going. we don't know what to expect because this has never happened before in human history. So it's like driving in the dark at night with fog on an unknown road. So the predictions have been systematically wrong in underestimating how quickly most of this would come and how severe it might be. And that's why the quote at the bottom is important. Joseph Romm, most of the uncertainty involves the possibility of even greater warming, not a steady state expectation, but leaps. The Guardian is, for my money, the best reporter of the problems of global warming worldwide. And they ran an article with a quote from a top insurance analyst from Allianz, talking about the uninsurability in the future and currently actually of houses, businesses, things that were destroyed because of severe weather. And I just thought this was kind of amazing. Climate crisis is on track to destroy capitalism. Well, let's don't talk about the several hundreds of millions of people who are going to die. So, but capitalism, well, okay, maybe this will motivate some people. I think a lot of people go through this. I certainly did. After you begin to study this conscientiously, you realize how bad it is. It's depressing. And you want to give up. And you turn to cynicism or fatalism, I think. Well, this is just going to happen. And what the hell can I do about it? And there is, as I mentioned, climate trauma, climate grief specialties in psychiatry and psychology now. But beyond that, I think, you know, the question is, what are we going to do? Because once you've seen this, it's very hard to turn your back and say, well, somebody else will take care of this. It isn't at all clear that anybody else will. So I'm in ethics. So I want to focus on the ethics of death. So I'm asking this question: what ethics is needed for a world catastrophe proceeding at an unpredictable rate? And I say a new ethic, yes, but it's really an old ethic. It's kind of new only in the sense that it's been fairly subservient and not dominant. So this is my sketch version of that. Our current dominant values: moral individualism, the ethics of I, independence. Liberty is our middle name, after all, in this country. And individual self-interest is thought to be the driving force for most everything. Not only economists assume this, but philosophers do as well. Philosophers writing about justice from this institution. We focus on what differentiates and distinguishes us. We need to set ourselves apart and say that we're special. Caring for others is then seen as philanthropy, and generosity is rather extraordinary. And justice, the model for justice, is grounded in contracts, an idea that contract making among free individual, usually white males, is the model that we need to follow to understand the issues of justice. Who said that? Locke, Rousseau, Kant, Jefferson, John Rawls have all used this as a kind of model for how you get a notion of justice launched and functional. This is what I think we need for the Anthropocene. Moral solidarity, the ethics of we, interdependence, shared collective self-interest, and a vulnerability that we share as the driving force for that. A focus on what unites and bonds us, caring for others from a sense of solidarity. And generosity becomes far more intuitive in that mode of thinking. Justice is then grounded in a communal awareness of our interdependence. And unlike the figures I mentioned from the previous slide, who were products of the American and European Enlightenment, We can draw from a tradition in the Scottish Enlightenment, very different. David Hume, Adam Smith, and most religious traditions actually also promote this kind of value set. David Hume said, justice has to be the kind of thing that even a young child can appreciate and understand. You don't need a lot of sophisticated theories to get there. You just need to figure out how are you going to share a candy bar between two people. Hume's example was two guys rowing a boat. You figure out pretty soon you need to cooperate or you're not going to go anywhere. You'll go in circles. And Adam Smith, you know, the so-called genius of self-interest, worked out of a social matrix, which was one of solidity and sympathy. And it was a kind of a next step. It wasn't the basis of everything. And we've forgotten that, of course. But I'm always irritated when I hear people talking about Adam Smith because they almost always get it wrong. Okay, just to put these side by side so you'll get a sense of the differences between them. The late Pope Francis, Laudato Si, you may have seen this. A shared responsibility for others in the world. So part of my analysis is trying to figure out how we got into this. And so I'm trying to identify what I call toxic habits of the culture. These are just some of them, the ones I think are important. Short-term thinking, political denial and incompetence, and responses of cynicism and fatalism, but we're all kind of tempted into, I think. Humans as the crowning endpoint of evolution. Well, we are really, aren't we? Gosh, I thought so. Maybe not. But if we are the crowning endpoint of evolution or the love child of the creator, you know, most like the creator, then we can do whatever the hell we want, right? Genesis has told us we're masters of the universe. So anyway, we have to get over that, I think. Consumerism as the chief measure of well-being. How do we measure who we are and how well we're doing? That's the question. Typically by what we consume. Not in our best moments, but too often, because that's what the culture encourages. And fantasies of rescue. I've talked to some of my neighbors who said, you know, God's just not going to let this happen. We're too important. He's going to save us in the end. That's because we are the crowning endpoint, you know. Other people, serious people, actually have said, we're going to think our way out of this. Technology is going to save us. Now, I don't just mean Elon Musk, who wants to put us on Mars. I mean, people like Bill Gates, who says, you know, we just need to scale up the technologies, and I think we'll get there. But there isn't any evidence for that so far. So, antidotes to this, as you might expect: legacy thinking, staying hopeful, taking action, relocating the human place in nature, common stewardship, solidarity, and global citizenship. You will have your own version of how to say this. This is just a sketch of what it might look like. This is a guy I greatly admire, Roman Krasneri. This book called The Good Ancestor, A Radical Prescription for Long-Term Thinking, I think is quite an important book. He took the title from Jonas Salk, who said, the greatest thing we can do in this life, the most important thing is to be a good ancestor. And these are what Krasneri calls good ancestor conversations. I really commend this book to anybody who wants to think about this in terms of the way long-term thinking can be a part of our thinking about global warming. Just take the last one, cathedral thinking. He said, think about the great cathedrals in Europe and the people who laid the cornerstones, knowing that even their grandchildren and great-grandchildren would not be around to see it completed, but they were part of something that was valuable for the future, and they believed in it strongly. James Baldwin, really too often overlooked. We're responsible for generations not yet born because we're the only witnesses they have. I think that ethical norms are always rooted in deep human experiences. They have a truth about them because we've experienced them, we feel them at more than just a cognitive level. And so I want to talk now for the rest of the time about what I think are kinds of experiences that we need to nurture in ourselves. First, love in the form of biophilia, awe and wonder related to nature, and reverence, the opposite of hubris. When I first saw this picture, this is from Apollo 11, I thought everything's going to be different now, right? Nah, no, it was for me. It was for me. And if you think about the astronauts who saw this from space, they talk about it as a new understanding they had about the fragility and the wonderfulness of living on this little marble in the middle of nowhere, and how that's where they belong. They knew this is where they belong. There's a technical name for that, and I can't remember it now, but people have written about this. Okay, here's a Harvard guy. Famous paleontologist. We cannot win this battle to save species and environments without forging an emotional bond between ourselves and nature, for we will not fight to save what we do not love. Well, this is what I've got on offer today. It's love. But it's not just any kind of love, right? And there are all kinds of forms of this. Here are just some of them. The Greeks had words for a lot of it. Eros, passionate physical love, longing and desire, falling in love. Philia, which is something Aristotle talked a lot about. Love between friends, high-minded affection between people who perceive value in each other. Agape, the spiritual love, egoless, mystical. And storge, which we don't talk about much at all, but was really probably the thing that's going to get through our lives, the most important thing to get through our lives for most of us. The affection that emerges from the mutual care of daily life, as in a family, not falling in love, but, if you will, standing in a place of love or residing in a place of love. Okay, but I don't want to talk about that. I want to talk about biophilia, the love of humanity for nature, an innate need to find connections between humans and other forms of life. And two sources I'm aware of, there are probably others, and I hope you'll fill me in. Erich Fromm, the mid-20th century psychologist, he said this is the opposite of necrophilia, a psychic crippledness. He was a big fan of Albert Schweitzer. He said, he's one of the people who said, you got to rethink all this stuff in Genesis about dominion. But this is the person who's had the most influence on me, another Harvard guy, E.O. Wilson, world famous man on insects. And he said it's an innate emotional affiliation for human beings with other organisms. And he says this is hereditary, it's part of our human nature. And the way we affiliate with other organisms is a defining feature of human beings, because all we now possess in terms of mental capacities has its matrix in other life forms. So where does this lead? If you're buying this, well, the sense of the earth is our only home, a creaturely love for habitat and for all the life forms in it, including the earth, which we need to consider as alive. And it's a kind of knowledge we have that's only possible actually through love. And I just want to ask you to think about another person that you love deeply and what kind of knowledge you have because of that love, the way love opens up to a kind of a domain of knowledge that is otherwise not possible. So a knowledge of myself residing not on the earth, like I'm on top of it, bouncing around, but rooted in it, I'm in the earth. This is a part of me. Awe and wonder are natural consequences of this. You may recognize on the top left, this is thought to be the oldest living tree, between 4,000 and 5,000 years old. It's the bristlecone pine. And the upper right is the view very close to my house, former house in Blowing Rock, North Carolina, Monument Valley and the moon. And the one on the right, this is a labyrinth built by the Vikings. And my wife, who is a big labyrinth walker, says, if you walk this labyrinth, you will find that the earth under your feet is hot. This is in northern Scotland, by the way. Yes, Darwin too, right? I'll just let you read that. Thomas Berry was a scientist, theologian. He said, we come into being in and through the earth. Simply put, we are earthlings. The earth is our origin, our nourishment, our educator, our healer, and so on. And then at the bottom, this really struck me. The physical degradation of the natural world is also the degradation of the interior world of the human. It's damaging to our souls. The poem from Wendell Berry. Let me just read it to you. When despair for the world grows in me, and I wake in the night at the least sound, in fear of what my life and my children's lives may be, I go and lie down where the wood drake rests in his beauty on the water, and the great heron feeds. I come into the peace of wild things who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. I come into the presence of still water, and I feel above me the day-blind stars waiting for their light. And for a time, I rest in the grace of the world and am free. This would lead to a kind of reverence, too, for life, for the earth. Wonderful book by Paul Woodruff, who's a University of Texas philosopher, on reverence. And one of the things he said, this is just the opposite of hubris, what we were talking about earlier, an inflated and mistaken sense of one's importance. Okay, enough of that. Now, what now? It's the question, I think. If you believe even half of what I've said, there must be something important that we could be doing. And this is just my suggestions. I really want to hear from you. What's important to do now? Urge your medical institution to reduce its carbon footprint. Medical institutions have big carbon footprints, as you might imagine. What can be done to reduce them? Be more politically active, because all policy is health policy. my public health colleagues have convinced me this. There's no policy that doesn't affect health in some way. Promote climate literacy, which increasingly is health literacy. It's amazing how many of the population are not literate because they just don't want to be literate. It's bad news and it's hard to figure out, but this has to be promoted somehow. Alter bioethics and medical education programs to include global warming as a primary health concern, and work against the miniaturization of ethics. Phrase from Norman Cousins, the former editor of Saturday Review, who talked about this as a danger for bioethics about 35 years ago, and it is. Promote the idea of a moral ecosystem and not simply individual ethics. And finally, these are just some organizations that are doing things, and I put the websites up. You can check these out. Healthcare Without Harm Practice, Green Health, Healthier Hospitals. The Center for Climate Literacy is the only one I know of. It's at the University of Wisconsin, which at all levels of education is promoting and creating educational materials to be used in schools. So it's really quite a valuable resource. Okay, that's all I've got. So. Right, for questions and comments or rebuttals.
Absolutely. So, Larry, thank you so much. I'm Scott Podolsky from the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine, and have our monthly seminar series. Really proud to co-host you for this today. Wonderful. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
And certainly time for questions for anyone. I'll go fix that. Let's see what's going on online.
So we're a Department of Social Medicine, as you know. And really, I think for us, the strongest determinant of ill health is poverty. And so when I think of my love of nature, I think, oh, I am privileged enough to be able to leave the city and go into the countryside and enjoy nature. And then I have a pet that I can afford to feed, and I interact with them. But, you know, impoverished people live in inner cities and really are, so how do we reconcile this love that almost seems a privilege of the affluent with our need to address poverty?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I don't have a simple answer, except that I think global warming just increases the amount of poverty worldwide because of all the things that we've discussed. So, you know, helping to ameliorate or at least slow down global warming is one way of trying to deal with poverty worldwide. But I don't know. I mean, I think I was looking around my hotel and around Harvard Medical Center and thinking about how many trees are there? Well, there are some. And there's is it the Jocelyn Park down here? That's available. I mean, there are still spots in which you can feel like you're a part of nature. But it's not an easy thing to do. And a lot of people live their lives without ever walking around barefoot in the dirt. So I don't have a good answer for your question, except that I think the problems I'm talking about just increase the problematic nature of poverty.
My question is actually kind of connected to what you just said. You talk about very convincingly that we won't fight for what we don't love. And there's lots of people not in poverty who don't have that sense of love or awe and reverence. And that's the part that I don't know how to make sense of, or whether or not that's something we can change.
I think for some of us, we have to lose it before we knew it was valuable. That is, don't like myself when I say this, but I think there's a certain amount of suffering that's required to bring a culture like ours around to its senses. And the question becomes, what are we losing? How are we going to survive? I can't pretend I'm doing all of this by myself anymore. And that's one of the fatal mistakes, is that we don't realize how much we already rely on the we-ness, the common stewardship for things. Like this university and all of its research programs, you know, are in fact a communal effort, like public libraries and roads and utilities. All of that is something nobody could provide for themselves, but we have to work together to do it. And that's just going to be increasing. So we have to get over the idea that we're just self-sufficient steel marbles rolling down and, you know, rolling down the path. But how do people get over that? I don't know. People have a hard time giving up not just luxuries, but things that have become to feel to them like necessities. Great question. I struggle with this, but I know we're not going to get where we need to be without appreciating the earth, you know, which is a one-time deal. You know, we just hit one shot at this, right? It's not as if we can replicate it. Most people don't realize that, I think, or not enough, I should say. And this is the role of literacy. I mean, trying to make people literate about what's happening. Maybe Miami will have to be underwater, you know, and parts of New York and Seattle. I don't know. Maybe it's when people can't insure their homes anymore. There's a certain amount of social collapse that's coming. I'm confident about that. Just how much, you know, depends on how soon we can wake up. Gosh, I sound so old. But I think it's true, and we can't cure this problem, but we can make it much less damaging, much less worse. I read an article, now this, don't quote me on this, but some scientist was trying to calculate. He said every 1/10 of a degree in global warming means 1 million people. It's 1 million lives. I don't know how you arrived at that, but I mean, some way of calculating this probably could be useful. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, thank you so
Hi.
much for the talk. This is wonderful. I'm a part of the master's program, and I'm curious what you think about moral responsibility for bioethicists. Like, would you say that we have a greater moral responsibility to put climate change and global warming at the forefront of whatever we're practicing after the program, or like in our work later on?
Yeah, I definitely do. Bioethics was captured by medicine in its infancy in the late 60s and early 70s. There were jobs in medical schools for people doing bioethics. There were no jobs for bioethics in public health programs, you know, or anywhere else. And so we learned to respond to the kind of issues that big tertiary hospitals have. How to deal with the angry family in the ICU, how to deal with informed consent problems. So clinical, individualized patient care became the model for what bioethics is. But in that process, we forgot the bios in bioethics. And, you know, that's where we are. So yes, you know, I've spent about 8 years trying to convince my current and former colleagues that, you know, they could do more.
So I wanted to maybe just follow up on Megan's point. You know, I live and work in both the United States and in India, and it's interesting in both these countries. There is in communities like us a recognition that climate change is man-made. that it is something that requires a political solution. But both
Yes.
countries are democracies. At
Yes,
least we think they are. And I think within the democratic system, the governments that are elected are also reflecting the views of the people who voted for them. In
Right.
India, for example, the argument that Megan made is a very dominant one, that India is a predominantly poor country and using more energy is the way out of poverty. And it's unfair at this point in history, just because the West has polluted the world, that Indians or other low resource, low income country peoples must now suddenly have to change their lives before they get better. In other words, they're stuck in poverty. But in the United States, I see a very different argument, which is drill, baby, drill. And that dispensation is ruling.
it is.
So how do you, I struggle with this. How do you balance the ethics of democracy, that public opinion is driving political forces, from the views of people who, like ourselves, are currently seen as being out of step with what the majority view is?
Yes. Yeah, it's such a great question. That's right. I once used to think that Democrats and Republicans in this country would be stepping over each other to try to prompt and promote their particular solution to global warming. That still might happen, but it hasn't yet, because it would be such an urgent, widely felt issue that you would have to do something. But that's the point at which something will get done, I guess. And that's why I say I'm just not very sanguine about anything happening unless there's more suffering. But you're raising a very important question about underdeveloped countries and the ways in which, of course, people are pulled out of poverty is by energy use. So how do you justify that? I've seen one person, and I won't remember their name. If I find it, I'll send it to you. He had a sliding scale. He said, for example, India does not have to decrease its carbon output, but the high users, like the United States and Western Europe, need to do that. And that way you could at least address both kinds of problems. But that kind of global equity, you know, Cass Sunstein thought it was a good idea, but I don't know that people are promoting that. And I don't have a good solution to that. I'm sorry. But some ingenious guy, I think it was somewhere in the UK, had developed a scale based on carbon usage and also the number of impoverished people in the country and how you might equitably try to deal with that.
So there are two questions on the line that are both about sort of public strategizing. So the first one, apropos for a question that has both Stephen Jay Gould and Ian Wilson on the same side of the debate, is that kinship and kindness have a common linguistic ancestry about family. How can we together support a public narrative that embraces our interrelatedness? And the second question, which Dr. Hazel, thank you. I worry that highlighting the deleterious effects of global warming on human society reinforces a kind of conflict of ethics. Us versus the environment, us versus them, also in the fight against the environment, as opposed to the reverence and ethics of interdependence that you counsel. In other words, the argument you offer provides good reason for the ethic that you counsel. There may be more effective ways of persuading people to adopt the ethic you counsel. I'm curious about what you think about strategies for persuasion beyond rational argumentation. So I guess both of these are about how do we convince people to, especially on the current moment, to adopt this kind of ethos.
I don't think anybody's ever changed their mind, except probably the people in this room, because they were rationally persuaded by the superior argument, you know, to take a different point of view. Most people don't function that way. One of the lessons I learned from trying to be a hospital ethics consultant for many years and finding the way people function is finding their orientation. And that's about feeling that they are doing the right thing, getting oriented, getting focused, and saying, this is the kind of person I am. So I don't think rational arguments will ever get us there, honestly, as a population. It'll get you and me there, but we'll be in our lonesome. But the idea that you have to appeal to a certain kind of deep understanding about who people are. And I just think that's key. So, you know, I'm groping in the dark like everyone else, trying to figure out what will be persuasive. And I finally don't know. But I think there are things that we can emphasize that we haven't. And part of that is the fact that we already have so many things that we are in common supporting and rely on, and amplifying those, and saying we could be this way with regard to the environment as well. But one step might be figure out what your own individual carbon footprint is. You can go online and figure that out. And then see what you could do to reduce it. And I'm not saying that's the solution. I'm just saying that you need to feel some kind of affinity, some kind of loyalty, some kind of belonging to a movement. And this is a way to do it. To say, this is what I have done and what I'm striving to do to help the problem. If enough people did that, you know, it would make a big difference. That's not an answer, but it's the best I can do. Alan.
I think this is an area where, you know, there's a cultural and political disjuncture from what we sort of learned, you know, your early slides about, you know, how catastrophic our current trajectory is. And as you explained, you know, the notion of what we can do about it, and very strongly based not on additional knowledge, but on some kind of cultural affective change. And in those instances, I fear that the cynicism and fatalism overwhelm our sense of individual change and solidarity among those of us who understand, you know, what's at stake, even if we've learned to love nature. So, you know, one thing Paul Farmer taught all of us is that there's no place for cynicism. And, you know, he was taking on giant problems personally, and people said, don't you get burned out? Don't you want to give up? And he just said, there's no place for cynicism in global health equity. And this is similar, but the character of the problems, the misinformation, the political context are so difficult. So is there a strategy for resisting the kind of, you know, we've been doing a lot, talking a lot about it for 50 years, and we seem to be going in the wrong direction. And that leads me regrettably that my cynical self begins to, you know, be talking in my ear.
Yeah, no, I think, you know, Paul Farmer was very wise, and the problem of cynicism and fatalism are really quite real. But this is one reason that I introduced Krasneric, because it's the long-term thinking that is helpful here. You know, this business about laying a cornerstone in the cathedral, you'll never see. So this will not get solved in the lifetime of my children or my grandchildren, but I might make a small difference.
Yeah.
And if I can do that, it keeps me from becoming too cynical, at least too cynical all the time. But yeah, I think that's a real problem, Alan. Because it sometimes you read the statistic and it's like, well, this is just hopeless. Of course, there's a lot that will be lost, but maybe there are things that can be saved as well. So there has to be some hope, you know, long-term hope that informs this, and encouraging that in people. People who are hopeful are happier too, if that makes a difference to anyone. Studies have shown that over and over.
I may go in the opposite direction of hope on this one, so forgive me in advance, but knowing what happened, you talked about there might need to be enough pain that we all suffer before there might be collective will to try to effect real change with respect to climate change. But, you know, we just came through a pandemic. Over 1 million Americans died. There was a tremendous amount of pain, and it became politicized almost from day one, certainly from the first month.
Yeah,
And facts were, you know, facts became loosey-goosey or non-existent for a lot of people. And so, you know, I'm just wondering if it's a decent analogy to say, well, there's a ton of pain and suffering that we all experienced in COVID. It didn't result in everyone coalescing and saying, we need to do everything we can to prevent the pandemics. And some people continue to deny it, even as their family members are dying.
yeah.
So, you know, I'm wondering if there was a lot of suffering by people in this room, not just at the, you know, poorest ends of the earth or the ends of our society, but, you know, relatively affluent people who can be in a situation like that. Would that be enough pain?
You know, I don't know what the magic number is, but unlike, you know, the COVID epidemic and other epidemics, they kind of go away and they're forgotten, you know. And then we assign blame and who's at fault, here are the facts about it, and so on and so on. But with climate change, it's a rolling catastrophe with each wave worse than the next. So I think it'll be more difficult to stay in denial about it or to reinterpret it as something that just didn't happen, it didn't matter. That's what I'm guessing.
Do you think the California fires had any
Yes,
impact?
yeah, I think they did. And, you know, California's a state that needs the least amount of convincing, generally speaking. But yes, I think they did. The big flooding in North Carolina too had a huge impact. So if those can stay in the collective memory, that will help. But yes, I think that's right. There's a lot of under and unreported stuff too, like heat deaths. If we were tracking heat deaths, it could be an important index of where we are.
So, just actually in a medical setting, we have, for instance, at the county right now, a display on how international physicians for prevention of nuclear war medicalized nuclear war and leveraged their authority and their data to at least affect some change, although we're still Tuesday clock.
Yeah.
What could the medical profession or medical schools do to better promote this? You know, how can they leverage either data or their authority or both? In especially if people are not as convinced by rational persuasion as by feeling.
Yeah. Well, you know, medicine is an incredibly important profession. You still hold the respect of the public. People listen when you speak. Not everybody, of course, but a lot of people do. And so consciousness about the way in which ill health is, in part at least, a product of climate degradation could be an important part of the kind of message that people are transmitting to patients, to families, educationally. Yeah, I mean, you guys are still, you know, the most respected profession, so.
Well, time to speak. Sure. There was another from Calcino Alberri said, is there something, for example, to be learned from the ritual and norms within indigenous peoples and other communities that may operate in conferring norms beyond rational argumentation?
Yeah. Indigenous peoples really were much wiser about this than we European descendants have been. But let me just say something about the importance of ritual. If you have a ritual of honoring the earth, it can help deepen the appreciation of things. It's being thankful for clean air. Things like that. I mean, it's doesn't take any time to do it, and There's no set ritual. Any ritual is probably as good as any other if it's effective to you as a reminder. But ritualized behavior can be a great thing and get you out of your head into your body and into connection with the physical part of yourselves. Part of it is that we've just forgotten we're animals, you know. We are. We're just kind of sophisticated animals, and we forget that. We depend on the earth for everything that helps us survive. That's where we came from. But rituals help do that sometimes.
You're gonna show the sacred that's on that one slide
Yes.
as well. One of those
Yeah.
lines, for sure.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going back to your slide where you had the 3 quotations from the oil execs.
Yes.
And just thinking about, you know, them stepping back from saying we want to do something to business as usual in so
Yeah.
many words.
We've got a license now, right?
You know, and as sacrosanct as capitalism is in this country, like that's what we're up against, at least here in the United States. In thinking about what we might do to.
Yeah. Well, this was the genius of Biden. He never got a chance, too late in his life and all of that, you know, but there was a sense in which he said we have to make alternative energy economically feasible. It has to be a product that businesses will appreciate. And he worked very hard to try to develop in exactly that way. I heard a talk by, remember Al Gore? Not too long ago, and he was saying much the same thing. You know. You can put capitalism to work on this if you're smart about it.
I'm interested in your talk in terms of what it says about bioethics, medical humanities, rethinking this area of inquiry. And, you know, we've had a kind of rich discussion over time about, you know, is our department associated with the movement of medical humanities? And it struck me your talk is, you know, implicitly highly critical of bioethics and is offering a kind of very different approach to thinking about moral, ethical, and political questions. So I'm wondering if you might be willing to sort of give us an overview of how you're thinking about field change in bioethics, humanities, social medicine.
Yeah. Well, I've broken my sword on that anvil many times. It's, as I said earlier, the model of bioethics is essentially a medical ethics model, not a bioethics model. We were captured, we did our good work, and they were grateful and compensated us, but we neglected a great deal. And also, separation of bioethics from the other humanities and qualitative social sciences is a price we paid for doing that. That's why social medicine, in my view, you know, is a wonderful place because it kind of accepts that understanding of ethics as being a part of this larger humanistic enterprise, not a technical kind of enterprise. And so I think that's where we need to be in bioethics, which is another reason why I so often use poetry in my talks and presentations, is because you need to get at that depth of feeling, and poets frequently say this so much better than anyone else, certainly more so than discursive philosophical bioethics. But an ethics that just prizes autonomy and individualism to the extent that we have is very lopsided. It's a very one-dimensional, you know, Johnny one-note kind of approach to ethics, and we need this.
Yeah,
you know.
I really agree with that. During the pandemic, when there were people who were hesitant or resistant to vaccination, they typically cited, autonomy and informed consent. So the social ethic that you've described here, was not part of the discussion of vaccines. And when you hear Robert Kennedy Jr. say, everybody should make up their own mind and research the question themselves, you see the undermining of the social solidarity that's at the core of your argument.
Yeah, that's exactly right. But this is why the Scots actually got it right. They said justice comes out of families. You're born in dependence and you're always functioning in interdependence. And if you have some autonomy, you have some freedom, that's always because you were given it. You were provided, you were supported by other people who allowed you to be free and make decisions like this. But it all relates back to that larger base, of social nestedness that is really who we are. That's why saying we're just really all animals is such a refreshing thing, because yeah, we are, just like animals groom each other, periodically, and to give each other food. That's where we are. That's what we need to be thinking about, how to do that better. Yeah, been a long battle with bioethics in my career.
Yes.
Just move it just a little. Yes.
I was thinking about my grandnephews and what they learn from very early days in entering school. So the 12-year-old at age 7 was designing a way to make a cloud. But his worry was that who could turn it on or off. And so I think we need to think about what is being taught in school. That's where the kids we're beginning to understand what climate change is, running around and trying to get their parents to recycle, bananas and compost and think up images that would be appealing to younger kids as they grow older. And so perhaps the effort of ethics should be defined with, in addition to what do you teach in grade school, preschool?
Yeah.
Because they're worried.
Yes.
They know. And they're trying to figure out what to do. And one way is to be a climate scientist. The other way is to be an anthropologist, which the 12-year-old now wants to combine.
Good.
So he's not unique to this world. The family lives in Connecticut. They have good educational systems in their town. So you don't have to go to California.
Right. I would refer to the Center for Climate Literacy, which is really a great resource for how can we educate around this. But I'm also kind of hopeful. One of the reasons is one of my granddaughters is a senior at Case Western Reserve, majoring in biochemistry. Can't get a job now, of course. But she had very sophisticated environmental studies courses as just a part of her major. And I was astounded. Really good courses. I thought, wow, some universities are really doing this well. And so that makes me believe that, we are probably doing a lot better now. So I'm modestly hopeful.
But
That's
the
the thing.
question of who has the control
Yeah,
is a very important question.
it is, it
And
is.
how does it get set, how does has the control gets done? Who determines that?
Right, that's why it's ultimately political. I mean, we
Right.
have to sort politics
Right.
of this.
Well, on that note of somewhat optimism, thank you so much, Churchill.
Thank you.
Yeah.